everyone, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. Today we're going to talk about a subject that may have never crossed your mind: hunting with a crossbow. Have you ever thought about it? In my mind, crossbows fall into the other hunting weapons category, along with muzzleloaders, handguns, air guns, atlatls. That last one is a joke, but you get the idea. Crossbows just aren't as common as rifles or even vertical bows. And there's a few reasons for this. First of all, in many states, crossbows aren't legal to use during archery season. And secondly, there's some stigma around crossbows even when they are legal. Crossbows are a bit easier to learn and use than vertical archery equipment. And some archers feel that crossbow hunters have an advantage during bow season. Archery seasons are often earlier than modern firearm seasons, partly because bow hunting is super challenging and bow hunters need all the help they can get. So when someone shows up with a crossbow that's accurate out to 80 yards and they've got a scope on it, it kind of feels like they're cheating. But here's what I think. If crossbows are legal to use in your area and you can get past the stigma, they can actually be a very useful tool in your hunting arsenal to extend your hunting season and help you kill more animals. And I have some experience with this myself, which we're going to talk about today. Before we get into it, if you enjoy this podcast, if you've learned something new, please support the podcast by sending an episode to a friend, by rating it 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening on. Doing these things will help the podcast grow and help more people get outside and into hunting, which is what Persistence Outdoors is all about. So thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate each and every one of you who listen to this podcast. And let's dive into our topic for today. I want to start off by telling you a little bit about how and why I got into hunting with a crossbow. A few years ago, I was living in Tennessee, and I was living in a part of Tennessee that had a lot of deer. In fact, in the units that I hunted during deer season, the limit was 3 does a day. There were that many deer. I had hunted modern firearm season, and I realized that there was also a 6-week archery season before modern firearm season. And while modern firearm season was great, after that first weekend, the deer became very pressured. There were lots of hunters, and the land that I was hunting was public land surrounded by private land. So the unit I was in was actually just a collection of sort of postage stamp sized public land pieces. And then they were just surrounded by private land. So after that first weekend of hunting in the modern firearm season, a lot of those deer would push off the public land and go hang out on private land. And this is a classic issue. It's always going to be harder to hunt once the animals are pressured. But I realized, again, that there's this 6-week archery season before the modern firearm season. And because there were so many deer, I felt really motivated to get out and hunt archery. So first I started looking into vertical archery equipment, like your modern compound bow. And I kind of went in with this notion that it would be not too expensive. It wouldn't be that complicated. I had shot bows as a kid, just low poundage, fun backyard bow shooting. And I was hoping that it would be less expensive than buying a new rifle. And I figured that I would buy a bow and I would have it for a long time. And it would be something that I would do pretty much throughout the rest of my life. So it would be a worthwhile investment. Well, I started getting into it and looking at everything that's required. And I realized a couple things. One, it's way more expensive than I expected. 2, I didn't really have a place to practice enough to where I would feel confident hunting with a vertical bow. So what I mean by that is I was living in an apartment and I didn't have a place that I could just go shoot in the backyard. And it seemed to me that I would want to be shooting every day or a couple times a week to be able to develop the skill set that I needed to be confident hunting with a vertical bow. So after looking at it a little bit, I realized that I wasn't quite ready to commit to a vertical archery setup. But I noticed when reading the regulations that crossbows were also legal during the archery season. And so this sent me down a whole new path. In my mind, I was thinking, okay, a crossbow, it has a scope, it has a trigger. If I can shoot a rifle, I can certainly shoot a crossbow. And I was just thinking about stacking does. I was driving a Corolla at the time, a Toyota Corolla, and I was trying to figure out how many does I could fit in that car because that's how far ahead of myself I was. That's how confident I was that I was going to go out and kill deer. So with crossbow hunting, you still have the issue of the cost of the equipment, but I was lucky to find a full setup on Craigslist. I searched around a bit and I found this. I kind of priced it out and it looked like it was a good deal. The crossbow was an older model, but I figured as long as it looked like it was in good condition, I would take it and try it out. And I think I got it for $150 or $200. And when I met up with the guy, he had actually just bought a new crossbow to hunt with, and he was getting rid of his starter bow. And so it was actually a really good deal because it had everything I needed to get started. It was all put together. There were string silencers on the string. There were shock dampeners. There was a scope that was sighted in. It had a good trigger. It came with some arrows, with some rail lube, with some string wax. So everything was kind of there. And he even told me what sort of broadheads to use. And so I was set up for success right from the start. I really didn't have to go through the whole process of buying a new bow and matching that up with arrows and this, that, and the other. So I was lucky in that sense. And I think it just goes to show that sometimes you can get really good deals on hunting equipment from other hunters out there who really do want you to succeed, and they want to be able to pass on their used equipment to someone else who's going to get some use out of it. So it's always worth looking on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace or someplace like that to find a good deal. Anyway, I got some chances to shoot it before season, and one of my first impressions was that there's actually a lot more archery involved with a crossbow than you might expect. I was thinking it has a scope, it has a trigger, I'm going to be able to shoot it like a rifle. And while that's true, I had to learn about all sorts of different archery related subjects. So arrows, spine and grain weight, broadheads and field points, flight paths, the strings, all of these different things that come along with this mechanical crossbow that you don't have to worry about with a rifle. So I was able to sort all those things out, get the crossbow shooting well where I wanted it, and I went on to kill 2 deer with it that season. And I also hit another deer that I lost, which we'll talk about a little bit more because that was a mistake on my part. So that's the background. The reason I got into crossbow hunting was to extend my hunting season, and it worked really well for that. Now, I will tell you that at the end of it all, I have no real love for the crossbow platform. It's not as convenient as a rifle. In some ways, it's not as convenient as a vertical bow. And so while it was helpful to extend my hunting season and I did kill deer with it, and I was grateful for those opportunities, I wouldn't necessarily get into crossbow hunting just for the sake of hunting with a crossbow. And when I moved to Idaho a couple years ago, I actually sold the crossbow because I saw that it wasn't legal to hunt during archery season with a crossbow in Idaho. And so for me, it was like, what's the point? It's not really something I'm going to go out and shoot for fun. During the modern firearm season, I'm going to use my rifle instead. And I feel like it's just going to sit around collecting dust. All that being said, I want to tell you what it's like using a crossbow so that if you're interested, you can make an informed decision. So like I said earlier, one of the first things I noticed is that there's just more archery involved than you might expect. One big difference from modern firearms is that you're using arrows. And so when you're using arrows, there's a couple things you need to know. First of all, you're going to lose some arrows. Just because you have 6 arrows or a dozen or whatever doesn't mean that's going to be enough, because you may lose some arrows in the process. You may lose it just because you don't hit your target. You may hit something other than your target and shatter your arrow. They may wear over time. So arrows can quickly become expensive. And the other thing is your arrows have to match so that they will fly in the same way. So if you have a set of arrows and then you can't find the same shafts, or you can't find the same broadheads or whatever it is, you are going to then have to buy new arrows that match. And that was a little tricky for me because I got some arrows from this guy I bought the crossbow from. And then I went out to shoot them and quickly lost a few of them. I think I lost one and broke another one. And so then I had to find new arrows, and the ones that I had got were an older model or an older version. And so I bought the newer version, but they didn't fly the same way that the older arrows did. So I didn't realize right off the bat that I would need to be replacing arrows. And that was just a bit of a hassle that I hadn't factored in. You also need to learn about the spine and grain weight of arrows. And I'm not going to go super deep into it because, frankly, I'm not an expert on this, but you want to make sure that your arrow is strong enough to be shot out of your bow with the specific poundage of your bow, and so that the arrows won't flex too much and break. And they also need to fit with the grain weight of your field point or of your broadhead. And so this isn't too hard to figure out just going on the internet or talking to someone at a pro shop, but it's something you have to keep in mind. You can't just screw any broadhead onto any shaft with any bow and expect it to work out. You may get lucky and it may work fine, but sometimes you are going to have arrows that are underspined, meaning they're not rigid enough, and then you could end up breaking them, or overspined, and then you'll have issues with that as well. Another thing about arrows is that you have to learn the flight path of an arrow. And while it's generally the same idea as a bullet, it's just a much shorter distance and sort of like a condensed flight path, if you think about it. So with an arrow, you're thinking about significant drop between 30 and 40 yards. And so you have to recalibrate and readjust. And what makes it even harder is that sometimes your broadheads don't fly the same as your field points. So you have to actually go out and test your bow and your arrows with the broadheads that you're going to be using. You can't just expect that your field point at 100 grains is going to fly the same as your broadhead that's also 100 grains. They could fly differently, and you have to adjust for that. So using arrows is this whole new skill that you're going to have to learn about and become familiar with if you want to be successful using a crossbow. Crossbows also have all these different parts, which are very similar to vertical archery compound bows. So they have the string, they have the cams, they have the limbs, they have the riser, and then they also have crossbow specific parts like the flight groove, the arrow retention spring, the cocking stirrup. And so you have to be familiar with all of these parts. If you buy a crossbow fully assembled, you won't have to think about it as much, but you do need to be able to look at your crossbow and make sure that there's nothing that's too worn or anything that's damaged. And sometimes you have to diagnose why something's making a loud noise and then use string silencers or vibration reducers to make that stop. And so there's just a lot of new parts that you're going to have to get familiar with. And it makes a rifle seem simple in some ways, at least as far as the user interface is concerned. With a rifle, especially a bolt action rifle, you just lift the bolt, pull it back, push it forward, and you're ready to go. With a crossbow, you're going to have to go through this process of cocking the crossbow. You'll also need to make sure, like I said, that nothing's too worn. You're going to have to keep the string waxed. You're going to have to make sure there's nothing in the flight groove. And so it's just a lot of moving pieces that you need to be aware of that are not things that you have to think about when you're hunting with a modern firearm. Another thing that I didn't consider, and this isn't part of the crossbow, this is an accessory, but I didn't think about an archery target and how important that is. I had grown up shooting bows in my backyard, and these were very low poundage bows. They were maybe 15 to 30 pounds, maybe. And so I was able to shoot arrows into a bale of hay or into a berm or into even a cardboard box, and the arrows would stick. So I knew that I would need something more substantial to catch my arrows, but I was cheaping out and I didn't want to go and actually buy an archery target. And so what I did is I took an old blanket. It was like an old comforter that I had, and we didn't want it anymore. So I rolled it up tight and then I put it in a big bag, like one of those bags you get from Amazon when there's a gift wrapped up in it. And so I put this comforter tightly compressed into this bag and then tied the bag at the top, and that was going to be my archery target. Well, it worked okay for field points. I could shoot them in and it would catch it, but it would catch it all the way at the fletching, which was kind of damaging to the fletching after I did it a few times. And then the first time I tried it with a broadhead, the arrow just went straight through and it shot out the back. And so that led to me actually losing some arrows and then damaging broadheads. And what I should have done was just paid the money and got a more substantial purpose-built archery target. But that's something I never expected to be an issue. And it turned out to be a big issue because I was losing arrows and broadheads. And then the final experience that I had with a crossbow that is really typical of archery was shooting animals and then just being incredibly nervous about whether I had made a good shot or not. With a rifle, sometimes you get a reaction from the animal, and sometimes it might even fall down right there. And you feel pretty confident that if you felt good about the shot, that you've done significant damage. With a crossbow, you're slipping an arrow right through it, and then it runs off. And then you have to wait and then go track the animal. And there's just not the same confidence that you have with a rifle that you made a lethal shot. So maybe that's me just being a little inexperienced, but the whole mechanism of killing and the whole process after the shot is going to be exactly the same as that with a vertical bow. Even though you might have a higher FPS, you might have a further effective range and better accuracy. At the end of the day, you're still hunting with archery tackle. Now let's talk about some other things that I noticed when hunting with a crossbow. Handling was a big issue. My crossbow was about 20 inches wide, and it was very front heavy and cumbersome. When I was walking around with it, it would bump into trees, and it was uncomfortable to carry. And because of its balance, I sort of would be holding the forend, and most of the weight would be on that forend, and then very little would be back towards the stock. And so it just wasn't enjoyable to carry around. And it was much better suited for staying still and setting up on an animal. And my particular model didn't have a sling, didn't have sling studs or anything like that. And so there wasn't a great way to transport it other than just carrying it with both hands. Now, also, when you're shooting, the position of the limbs are going to change. So when you cock the crossbow, the limbs are pulled under tension and they're pulled back. But then when you shoot, they're going to snap forward quickly, and that flings out the arrow, right? But when you're shooting, you have to make sure that your limbs don't hit anything, because it could damage the crossbow, it could throw off your shot, it could be dangerous. So you always have to be aware of your surroundings much more than you do with a rifle. With a rifle, you can even use a tree next to you as a rest. With a crossbow, you're not going to have that opportunity. And so I concluded that I really wouldn't want to use a crossbow for spot and stock or for still hunting, because they're just so hard to move around with. Another thing that was tough about using a crossbow was loading and reloading. So to load the crossbow, you have to put your foot in the stirrup, and then you have to use this little pulley system with cocking ropes to actually pull the string back, because it's under so much tension. And so that takes a minute to do. And if your cocking ropes aren't the right length, that can be a little bit tricky. So you might have to adjust that and get used to it. It's not very quick. After you get your string pulled back, then you have to put your arrow in and you have to place it correctly and make sure it's touching the string where it's going to be shot out of the crossbow. Make sure your nock is lined up, all of that. And so loading was hard enough. Reloading is an even bigger issue. If you think about taking a shot on an animal, say you make a bad shot or you miss, well, now it's going to take you at least 30 seconds, if not longer, to reload and get back into position. And it's a pretty big to do, right? You're going to make some noise. You're going to have to move to reload. And in some places that you might be hiding, you might not have enough space. So you might have to stand up. And it's just not conducive to making quick follow-up shots. Oh, and I should say before I move on, the crossbow that I had couldn't be uncocked or decocked. So once you cocked it, you actually had to fire the crossbow to uncock it or decock it. I'm not sure what the right term is. So what I ended up doing is I would cock my crossbow and load it. But then if I didn't fire it when I was hunting, I would take a different arrow that was broken and put it into my crossbow and shoot it into the ground. Because I didn't want to shoot it empty. That could damage the bow because there's no place for that energy to be transferred. But I also didn't want to just be shooting my broadhead tipped arrow somewhere every time I needed to decock the crossbow. So that's something to look out for as well, or just to be aware of if you're buying a new crossbow or if you've got a crossbow and you can't figure out how to decock it. Okay, let's talk about crossbow safety a little bit. Crossbows actually have more dangerous features than a rifle. So with a rifle, you have to keep it pointed in a safe direction, right? And you have to keep your finger off the trigger when you're not ready to shoot. And those are both true with a crossbow. But When you're hunting, you also have broadheads. And broadheads are just inherently dangerous. They're little knives on the end of a stick, right? And so anytime you have a broadhead tipped arrow out of the quiver or you're handling a broadhead, you have to be super careful, especially because you want them to be sharp so that they can cut well. And it's just like having an open knife. You have to be really careful with them. Another thing you have to consider on a crossbow is the string path. Once you've cocked the crossbow, it's dangerous because it has a string just waiting to snap forward. And if you got your thumb in there or your hand in there, it could easily take off a finger. And it's really dangerous just because of that. So not only do you have the directional issue, and then you also have a broadhead sticking out of the end of your crossbow, you also have the string pulled back, ready to take off a finger. So a crossbow is dangerous in all sorts of different ways. And if you're not careful, you could end up hurting yourself really badly. Now, one thing that was super similar to using a rifle was actually shooting. I had no problem learning to shoot the crossbow and becoming accurate with it. One weird thing about a crossbow is that the shot impulse is forward instead of backwards. And so if you have any weird flinches going on, you can actually kind of exacerbate it with that forward impulse, and that can make you a little bit inaccurate. And it gets confusing when you're trying to figure out if your arrow is dropping too much because it's a different arrow, or if it's because of your flinch or just the slightly different shot impulse. It's not that big of a deal. It can seem surprising at first because your whole bow jumps forward, but you'll get used to it pretty quickly. Let's talk briefly about the cost. Crossbows are just like rifles in the sense that there's a wide variety and a wide range of prices. So there are some very affordable crossbows around $300. Then there's mid-range crossbows around $600. And then you can always find a very expensive kind of specialized crossbow or high quality crossbow for over $1,000. And you kind of just choose what you want at your price point. Some of those more expensive crossbows are going to have features like being able to decock the crossbow without firing it. They may be easier to pull back and actually cock. They might have a smaller width, an overall width, so it's a little bit more maneuverable and balanced. So there's different advantages that you're going to get at different price points. I would say that crossbows generally are pretty affordable. What's going to get you is the new parts, the new arrows and broadheads, your target, and even a carrying case if you want to. All of these are kind of specialized things, and with the crossbow, over time, parts are going to wear out. And you're going to lose arrows, and you're going to need a target that can handle getting pummeled with broadheads. And so when you start to look at all the different little individual parts, they can really add up and create quite a bill. For me personally, it was just losing arrows and damaging broadheads, and then having to buy new arrows and buy new broadheads. And broadheads aren't cheap. They usually come in a pack of 3, and just depending on what you're using, they can be very expensive. So that's something that I just didn't factor in when I first went into it. Maybe I should have, but I just didn't expect to lose and damage arrows the way that I did. So you just have to keep in mind that there are a lot of peripheral expenses involved. So those are some of the things that I learned from using a crossbow, some of the differences and similarities to using a rifle. Let's run through some pros and cons to help you decide if a crossbow is right for you. The major advantage is that it shoots pretty much like a rifle. If you are accurate with a rifle and you can understand the flight path of an arrow, you'll be able to become accurate with a crossbow. And it's not going to take that much practice if you already have good shooting mechanics. So I wouldn't be afraid to give someone who's shot a rifle and I know can shoot a rifle well, I wouldn't be afraid to give them a crossbow and kind of show them how it works and take some practice shots and then send them out to hunt with it as long as they keep their shots within a reasonable range. I think that would be perfectly ethical and they would be able to be successful with that crossbow. Another huge advantage is the extended hunting season. So that's the reason why I got a crossbow in the first place. And like we talked about, if there's an archery season and crossbows are legal, it's like, why not get a crossbow? If you can't commit to a vertical bow or you don't want one for whatever reason, but you do want that extra month of hunting season in some cases, or in my case, a whole month and a half, why not get a crossbow? It's just going to lead to more hunting opportunities, which is what we want. Some other advantages of crossbows are the precision, the feet per second, and the range that you can achieve with a crossbow. And crossbows will generally outperform vertical bows in these categories. And so that's really nice if you're trying to extend your shots a little bit further than the common archery standard, which is about 40 yards. And I can also think of applications for this in places where you really need that precision and you don't have any room for error. Let's say you're trying to knock back the deer population in a more urban area, and you're hunting on a very small piece of private property. Well, you need to make a perfect shot so that the deer dies quickly and you can recover it easily without it running off the private property. And I think a crossbow would just be perfect for that. You're just eliminating some of the human error that you could have with a vertical bow. That's a very specialized situation, of course, but I think you can extrapolate those characteristics to other situations you might find yourself in. Another advantage of crossbows are that people who can't shoot a normal bow may be able to shoot a crossbow. So this may be because of a disability or because of your eyesight just not being as good. And lots of adults, as they're getting older, they're having a harder time seeing through the peep sight on their compound bow and seeing without any sort of enhancement. So using a scope on a crossbow allows them to successfully hunt in archery season. You might also use it with kids. Maybe they're just not strong enough or they're not quite dependable enough to use a vertical bow yet for hunting. Well, you could put a crossbow on a tripod and have a really stable shooting platform for a kid to hunt with. And that might be a great way to help them be successful. And then finally, one thing that I really liked about hunting with a crossbow was that it was quiet. I didn't have to hunt with ear protection. And of all the arguments for bow hunting, this is maybe the one that resonates with me the most. I enjoy being out in the woods without anything impeding my hearing. I can act like a predator. I can listen like a predator. And I'm not operating under the threat of my eardrums being blown out when I pull the trigger of the rifle. And there's been times when I've missed shot opportunities because I was fiddling with my ear protection. So I really enjoy the piece of it. Also, after you pull the trigger, the animals aren't going to be spooked in the same way that they are with a rifle. And if you pay attention, you can also hear how the shot impacts the animal. That wet, hollow thump sound is great confirmation that you've made a vital hit on the animal. If there's one thing that I do miss about using a crossbow, it's being able to hunt without ear protection. I just found it very enjoyable. All right, let's talk about some of the disadvantages of hunting with a crossbow. So like I mentioned, it's very unwieldy. It's not ideal for moving around. They don't have the best balance. They are kind of cumbersome and wide. They may get caught on trees and brush, and you have to be careful about where your limbs are moving when you're taking a shot. And you also have to be careful about your limbs and make sure they're not in the way of the string. So they're just a little awkward. They're also complicated. There's lots of moving parts, and you need to be aware of them. You need to make sure that certain parts aren't wearing more than others. So you need to make sure that your limbs aren't cracking, that your string isn't fraying, that your rail where the arrow slides is lubricated properly. There's just a lot of things to pay attention to. Now, side note, I just realized I've been calling crossbow bolts arrows when the actual name is a bolt, and it's just a shorter, generally a little bit thicker projectile that's used with a crossbow. I don't think anybody's going to get mad about it, but technically with a crossbow, it's a bolt and not an arrow. Anyway, you know what I mean. Another disadvantage is that there is a learning curve to using archery equipment, and it's just important to remember that while it shoots somewhat like a rifle, it's not a one-to-one translation. One place where you'll see the difference between a rifle and a crossbow is the range. While you can get better range than a vertical bow with a crossbow just because you have more power, it's still not going to equal that of a rifle. When I was hunting with my crossbow, I limited myself to 40 yards. That was the furthest I felt comfortable shooting and making an accurate shot that would still send the arrow through the animal. Some people talk about shooting their crossbows all the way out to 80 or 100 yards. It just depends on your setup and your skill level, but it's not going to be anything like a rifle where you can easily shoot a rifle out to 200, if not much further. You know, way back towards the beginning, I mentioned shooting a deer with a crossbow, but not recovering it. And that was because I made a bad shot. I was sitting on the ground waiting for a buck to come in a place I had seen him travel through before. And he came in very quickly and much closer than I expected him. He came in traversing from left to right at maybe 20 yards. So I put up my crossbow and I had my fixed 4-power scope on this deer. And he was so close that he looked huge in the scope. And he was still moving. He was just trotting along. And I instinctively aimed where I thought his vitals were, but I pulled the trigger before he stopped moving. And that was my major mistake. I should have calmed down and waited for him to stop moving to get a good, clean shot. Well, with the crossbow, even though I may have been aimed exactly where I wanted to hit when I pulled the trigger, the bolt is going slow enough that that deer took 1 or 2 steps before the bolt actually hit him. And so I ended up hitting the deer way back. And so I could immediately tell that the deer wasn't hit super well. It didn't buck or kind of react like a deer that's been hit well. And it made a slow semicircle to my right and behind me. Now, at some point, I started reloading my crossbow, which is what I should have done immediately. But I think I got distracted by looking at the deer and trying to make sure it didn't go off into any brush. And so I was kind of looking up at it and then looking down, trying to reload. And because that crossbow is complicated to reload, I didn't get a bolt in and didn't get another shot at that deer. And it eventually walked off into some thicker brush where I couldn't see it, and I had to let it go and track it later that evening. So long story short, I came back about 3 hours later with a buddy, and we ended up tracking it to the edge of public land. It had gone just over the boundary and bedded down, and we actually heard it get up and move off at about 12 p.m. And that was heart-wrenching. The next day I came back and got permission to track it across the private land. and ended up losing the deer. The blood trail went cold. So it was a heartbreaking experience. And looking back on it all, it's interesting because if I had taken that shot with a rifle, most likely the deer would have been dead. That bullet would have got to the deer a fraction of a second sooner. It would have hit it further forward, and I could have set up a follow-up shot almost immediately. Now, I should have waited for a better shot opportunity, even with a rifle. So I'm not saying that as an excuse, but reflecting on the whole scenario, having a rifle instead of a crossbow might have made a difference. The final disadvantage to hunting with a crossbow is the stigma. And some people just aren't going to like it that you're using a crossbow during the archery season. In my opinion, if it's legal and you feel good about it, I don't see any reason why not to. And if it is an issue for people, they can go through the appropriate channels to get the rules changed. So I wouldn't be deterred by any sort of stigma, and I imagine it will lessen as crossbows become more and more common. All right, guys, that's it for today. I hope this podcast was helpful for you, especially if you're looking into buying a crossbow for the first time. If you have any questions about using a crossbow or anything else hunting related that I could help you with, feel free to drop a comment in the YouTube comments or the Spotify comments. Send me an email at persistenceoutdoors2022@gmail.com or send me a message through the Persistence Outdoors Instagram or Facebook. With that, I will wrap this up. Thanks so much for supporting the podcast, and I will catch you next week.